Yeah, I mean, much live streamed, I see. I was just saying that I really like the fact that, internet platforms now are more widely attended. It's not a strange thing to do anymore, and you reach so many more people. It's
Yes.
great.
Yeah, exactly. This is good for teaching, of course, as well, and just for general outreach. So
Yeah.
that's good. Mohammed, you also, I think it's 3 o'clock. Did you turn on the YouTube live feed as well?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Perfect.
I'm also just now checking.
It's not a.
Yeah, now we are live.
Okay. All right, and I'll guess I'll get started then. It's 3 o'clock. So welcome again, Chris, and welcome everyone else following this Source to Sync. I think yes, perfect. Thank you. Welcome to everyone else on this platform, on Zoom, and also on other channels. I'm taking over from Paul this week. He's traveling currently, actually back from Utrecht, where he was visiting me last week. So I'm very happy to have Chris Stevenson with us here today on Zoom, talking about deep water sediment bypass. And before I introduce Chris, I will first, of course, for everyone who hasn't joined talks before or just would like an update, there's a YouTube channel you can use to view previous talks. There are now 135 since August of 2020, ranging from all kinds of different elements in the sediment and other elements cycle from source to sink. Next week we'll have another seminar by Martin Slowicz, who's from the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, Poland. At the same time, next Wednesday, talking about conditions to preserve the sedimentary record of channel planform in temperate zones of the Northern Hemisphere. So from the deep water that we'll visit today, a little bit further toward the coast. But that's next week. For this week, I'm very happy to have Chris Stevenson with us here today. He's joining us from Liverpool, where he's a senior lecturer, researching all kinds of elements about submarine gravity flows. Before he joined the University of Liverpool, he did his bachelor in geology at the University of Leeds. Following that, he did his PhD in marine geology in Southampton, staying for a year as a postdoc in Southampton. And then after some stays at Leeds and Manchester, joined the University of Liverpool in the Department of Earth Science, looking into quantitative sedimentology. So with that, Chris, I'd like to transfer this back to you, and very happy and very excited to see what you'll be presenting today.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
I share.
I will share my screen. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yes, this is perfect. Thank you.
Good. Right.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me today to talk about deep water sediment bypass. This work is largely based around a paper that I wrote back in 2015 with the co-authors that you see scattered around here. But since then, I've worked with numerous other colleagues around the world. So this co-author list of affiliations and collaborations is by no means exhaustive. So today we're going to address three fundamental questions. what is sediment bypass and what controls sediment bypass in deep water systems? And then how is that bypass expressed in the stratigraphic record? Okay, so that means the rocks and the cores and the field data. And then finally, we'll look at whether we can quantify sediment bypass through deep water systems. Okay, so it's quite a simple, blow-by-blow structure, but as you'll see, addressing each one of these questions is not straightforward. So, what is sediment bypass? The best way of showing you or describing sediment bypass is by showing you a video. This is an experimental turbidity current. We're looking side on, and the red line or the red dots are velocity measurements. Right, so what you can see is a rather powerful turbidity current passing from left to right with a high velocity base, and it's transporting a great deal of sediment. But actually, when you look right at the base, there's not much in the way of deposition. The bed is not abrading. This flow has lots of sediment, but it's basically bypassing most of that sediment down the tank. So that's the qualitative description of bypass. Now, can we get a better handle on the physical controls on that bypassing process? Well, here is a really accessible, easy to understand slide. Yeah, lots of equations, lots of numbers, lots of references. All of you will be familiar with reading papers like this, where it's just so difficult to really get to grips with what physical controls really matter when we're trying to understand flow behavior. Is it, the maximum grain size that a flow can carry? Is it how turbulent the flow is? Or is it some form of carrying capacity? Well, I've boiled it down for you and simplified it. The main physical controls on sediment bypass in gravity currents are grade size, sediment concentration, slope, and flow size. Grain size, it's just the size of the grains. Coarse is sand, fine is mud. The concentration of sediments is fundamental to the flow's ability to transport and suspend that sediment load. And that is separate from the size of the grain. Okay? Now, I particularly like this slide because it simplifies the Jay-Z equation of downslope gravitational driving force. The key physical parameters that dictate the flow's speed is the steepness of the slope and the thickness or the size of the flow itself. All right? So we've got some very simple parameters that we can keep in our heads when we're in the field looking at deposits. Grain size, sediment concentration, slope, and flow size. Okay, so that introduction to bypass in gravity currents is a very sort of engineering perspective, yeah? Sedimentologists with a background in physics or engineering will be familiar with a lot of those physical parameters and relationships. But the critical question is, how does that behavior express itself in the field? How do deposits and the lack of deposits reflect varying degrees of bypass in deep water systems? Now, to address this, actually, we need to take a step back and reevaluate what we think when we look at turbidites in the field. Because when we look at these, for example, this slide, big, thick, sandy turbidites, yeah, we think of deposits. We think strongly depositional flows in the system. But actually, if you think about the aerial extent and the overall run-out distance of an individual turbidity current, these can be tens of thousands of square kilometers in aerial extent and hundreds of kilometers in terms of downslope run-out distance. So, when we're looking at even a thick bedded sandy turbidite, we are only looking at a tiny fraction of the overall sediment load transported and delivered into the basin. So actually, to start this off, I'm going to make the statement that all turbidites record mostly bypass most of the time, representing most of their sediment load going downslope from the point where you're at. Okay? And that applies to even these big, thick, sandy deposits. Okay? And the question is, are there more or less, or relatively, are there facies that we can use to distinguish between zones of more or less sediment bypass? Okay? And so, to anchor this this section of the talk, I'm going to be coming back to this figure. Okay? So, sediment bypass has a suite of distinctive facies and sedimentary textures and larger scale architectures that we can identify and interpret to use as tools to identify particular zones in deep water systems where sediment bypass is the dominant form or dominant process versus areas where flows are more depositional. Okay, but remember, this is a relative relationship because most turbinites are mostly recording bypass. All right, so it's a relative distinction. So, first of all, we're going to look at facies, getting in detailed to look at these sedimentary textures and explore what sort of processes they represent and why those textures exist. So, bypass facies at the bed scale, so we're talking, grain scale up to, a meter or two. We have distinct textures that represent periods of acute sediment bypass within an individual event bed. And the key feature to look out for is a sharp change in grain size within this event bed. Okay, and we will, I'll explain how grain size breaks work, and then we'll go into how grain size breaks, or these abrupt transitions in grain size, are reflected and represented in other features in the rock record, such as scours, mud-draped scours, thin beds, coarse-grained lags, and other such features. Okay, so, but everything is based on this abrupt transition in grain size that we otherwise would not expect in turbinite deposits. So, grain size breaks are a departure from the world famous boomer model of turbinite deposition, where we have a coarse grained base and then a normally graded profile up to finer grained sands and into muds. That model assumes progressive deposition throughout the lifetime of the flow. Actually, what is far more common is that individual beds contain abrupt or sharp changes in grain size upwards through the bed. And here's a conceptual example that illustrates some of the different types of grain size break you can encounter in turbinite deposits. So at the bottom there, type 2 grain size breaks, we have an inversely graded base, which suggests the flow velocity is increasing. And at some point, that flow velocity becomes enough that it suspends everything in the flow, and it in fact erodes the previous deposit and transports everything downslope for a period of time. After a while, when the flow wanes, deposition recommences, but much further back towards the tail end of the flow. In this tail end of the flow, sediment is much finer, and therefore the deposits basically miss that intermediate grain size. And then as the flow decelerates, we get other types of flow transformation that generate hiatuses in that progressive deposition of sediment from the flow. But the key thing to take away here is that every time you see an abrupt, sharp transition in your grain size profile, it means that those intermediate grain sizes have been reworked and transported downslope So here's a real life example from the modern day Agadir Basin. And on the left-hand side of the screen, this is a cord turbidite from an individual event. And so you can see complex grading profiles, including several sharp surfaces where we see abrupt changes in grain size. When we map this bed down slope, we find those missing grain sizes. Okay, so grain size breaks are the key feature you want to be looking for any sort of acute bypass behavior in gravity flows. So, to hammer home why this happens, grain size breaks are produced because of the front to back structure of the turbidity currents. Okay? So initially, the head of the flow arrives and then deposits rapidly coarse grain sediments, and then the head of the flow passes over, and then we have the body of the flow. Now, the body of the flow is actually faster than the front by about 30 to 40%. So, if flow velocities are faster, it's fairly typical, actually, that sediment is more easily transported, and therefore you might get a hiatus in deposition and a bypass surface, a grain size break being developed. Ultimately then, after this hiatus, the tail end of the flow can deposit on top of this surface as either fine-grained silts or muds typically. All right? So, grain size breaks are this intra-bed record of bypass within a single event bed. Right, so how do we apply this sort of idea of missing grain sizes to more readily identifiable features in the geological record? Well, let's look now at erosional scours, mud drapes, and coarse grain lags. Now, erosion is possibly the strongest evidence for sediment bypass in deep water systems because the flow is so powerful that it is actively eroded away and transported everything downslope. So there's in fact no record of the flow passing overhead. With that in mind, we need to understand that some of the implicit assumptions that we get taught as sedimentologists don't apply when thinking and interpreting bypass in deep water systems. We get taught at undergraduate level, coarse grain sediments are high energy, fine grain sediments are low energy. But actually, in gravity system or gravity flow deposits, that is not the case. If a flow is powerful enough to erode, it will also transport that coarse grain sediment load downslope. When it does slow down, it is only the fine grain material that is left. And so, there are plenty of examples where fine-grained, thin-bedded turbidites actually represent the highest energy flow conditions in the system. So let's have a look at some examples of that. In the basis of submarine channels, we commonly get, a nice erosional cut in the channel base. And then you might expect sands and conglomerates maybe to immediately overlie that surface. But actually, when we look in detail at these channel base cuts, we often find that they're draped with fine-grained, thin-bedded turbinites. All right? So, and only after, a metre or half a metre of fine-grained thin beds do you then start to get thicker sand deposits being recorded. This is an example from the Tres Pasos formation in Chile. But we see them in cores very frequently. Here's a core from the Karoo Basin in South Africa, and I'm going to zoom in on this top right-hand side of the chord interval, where the core has been drilled through a channel complex. And what you see in the core is a very subtle erosion surface immediately overlain by these fine-grained, thin-bedded turbinites. Only after 20 centimeters do you then get thick amalgamated sands, maybe some mudstone conglomerates. Yeah. So this idea of fine-grained thin beds being preserved in the most energetic environments is pretty common. And it's what I like to call high energy thin beds. And so here's another example from the Buzzard oil field in the North Sea. I'm going to zoom in on this innocuous looking shaly succession, where on first glance you would interpret this as a low energy part of the system, nothing really happening, yeah? But actually, when you look at these millimeter scale thin beds, each of them actually has an erosive base. They often contain mudstone clasts, and some of them even have coarse-grained lags along their base. So actually, these sort of pinstripe thin beds are actually representing high-grade, highly energetic, erosive turbidity currents that are bypassing all of their sediment down dip, and only when they get to the tail end of the flow do they deposit the fine-grained sediments that are left. And indeed, these high-energy thin beds in Buzzard are associated above with coarse-grained, thick-bedded sands, which we interpret as stacked channel deposits. Okay, so there's some fundamental reorganization you might need in your head now to think twice about just saying it's a shale, therefore it's low energy and you can ignore it. So on the flip side, if our sediment load is coarse enough, we can get coarse-grained lag deposits that immediately sit on top of these erosion surfaces. So, depending on the nature of the system, our erosion surfaces, our scoured erosion surfaces, might be mantled by mud and fine-grained sediments, or they might immediately be mantled by coarse-grained conglomeratic material, such as this example here. Okay, so I'm not saying it's a one-size-fits-all. I'm saying that the nature of the sediment supply affects what sorts of facies you want to identify and look out for in a bypassing system. Okay, so we've been looking at the kind of fine-grained detail of, bypass facies. Now I want to highlight the fact that there's a range of scales at which we can examine field data and the stratigraphic record. And as such, the expression of bypass changes, and we want to look out for and infer bypass from different features. Before I pop into that, actually, I just want to highlight the fact that in the red dots towards the distal end of the system, we can get bypass and complete bypass very distally in the system. So here's an example from the Agadir Basin, Northwest Africa, where about 300 kilometers along the basin, we've correlated an individual event bed from right to left, as you can see in the log correlation profile. And at about 300 kilometers from source, the deposits just pinch out completely. And this coincides with a change in seafloor gradients from 0.01 to 0.1. So it's a 10-fold increase in seafloor gradient, but it's not even a degree. So this is pretty flat. And then downslope, deposits reappear once the seafloor flattens out again. So I've shown you examples from of bypassing facies and examples of bypass from proximal channelized regions, but also the fact that changes in slope in distal localities can also induce very efficient bypass and sediment transport. Okay, so let's now scale up our observations to different types of data and whether we can infer bypass from thicker stratigraphic successions. So the answer is we can, but what we need typically is time constraints, and seismic data often provides geometries and timelines that we can use to identify zones where we would expect to see a thick depositional package, but actually that package is missing, and we can trace that surface into a depositional package downslope. here is an example of a mass transport deposit offshore Brazil, where the base of it is mapped out in the red surface, 2B, and the top surface is mapped out in the yellow. So what we can see in the upslope region is the landslide scar that's been infilled with cladoforms. We then see a compressed surface downslope that then expands into this chaotic unit, hundreds of meters thick. So in this interpretation, we have a major bypass zone on the slope that we can only interpret as such because we have the up dip and the down dip expression of the erosion and depositional part of the system. But we can use morphological features in our seismic stratigraphy to infer some sediment bypass as well. So channel features are essentially conduits for sediment bypass. So the sorts of facies that we were looking at earlier are often associated with channelized systems. And let's see if the video works. Yeah, brilliant. And channelized systems evolve and build over time, meandering and cross-cutting itself to produce quite complicated and complex stratigraphy that is cut by a myriad of erosion and bypassing surfaces. Okay, but we don't really need to know the detail, because if you see a channel complex or a channel morphology, you can infer that there will be a degree of sediment bypass down dip as lobes or sheet-like turbidite sands. Okay, but you can interpret that if you were to drill through these features, that you would encounter similar facies to those I've just described above. Mud-draped channel bases, perhaps conglomerate sands, and then thick-bedded sands. Okay, so that was a whistle-stop tour through the architecture of bypass in the stratigraphic record. We looked at the fine detail, at the grain and the bed scale, with grain size breaks and various features like erosion, mud drapes, and thin beds. We then looked at how these sorts of features stack and form or are associated with larger scale morphological features like channels or breaks in slope, where you can use different types of data to infer this sort of bypass. All of this is described in a lot more detail in the paper, but hopefully this gives you a flavour of the different tools you need to employ to interpret and think about bypass in deep water systems. Now, let's finish with, can we quantify the amount of sediment being bypassed at a given point in the system? The short answer is this is a really difficult question. Two examples from the field suggest that it is not possible at all. On the left-hand side, here's an example of a channel complex from the Karoo Basin, South Africa, where this channel complex is riddled with erosional cuts, bypass surfaces, representing hundreds of flows that have bypassed, eroded through that part of the system. Down dip, we have mapped about 40 cubic kilometers of sand-rich turbinite lobe deposits. So, on the right-hand side of the image, we have an example from the Agadir Basin where I have mapped an individual event bed. So this is one turbinite, where at the channel mouth, we have a single erosion and bypass surface produced by this event bed, and down dip of this erosion surface, there's about 50 cubic kilometers of sediment. So from these examples, you can see that an individual event producing a single surface can represent the same amount of material being bypassed as hundreds of bypass surfaces recorded in, let's say, a channel complex. Okay, so initially it doesn't seem possible. What about numerically? Well, recently I've been working with my PhD student on a simple 2D numerical model that simulates flows, gravity flows, passing down a slope and then either eroding, bypassing, or depositing across a flat basin floor. So the physics is very simple. It's just slope, flow size, concentration, and grain size. Yeah, those four key controls that we talked about at the beginning. So what this produces is quite beautiful stratigraphy, turbinite stratigraphy, albeit synthetic turbinite stratigraphy. But critically, because this is a numerical model, what we can do is interrogate this depositional or stratigraphic record. We can take sections through this stratigraphy at various positions along the slope and into the basin, and we can measure the proportion of sediment that has been bypassed downslope at any given point. And that's what the numbers at the bottom represent. And actually, what I would draw your attention to is the fact that actually, even way out into the distal part of the system, you're still getting over half or a third of the total sediment load being deposited further down dip. So, you know what I was saying at the start, turbinites, wherever you are, mostly represent bypass of most of the sediment down dip. This simple numerical model goes some way to illustrating that point I made earlier. Now, the other interesting and exciting thing this model allows us to do is to trace timelines through this stratigraphic package. And that's what those blue lines are through the logs. And so what you'll see is that at various points along the profile, we get surfaces, bypass surfaces being developed that down dip, split, and thicken into distinct sedimentary packages. So these surfaces are not regular, they're sporadic, and they represent a variety of thicknesses down dip. So this just highlights the complexity in trying to tackle that question of how do we put numbers on the sediment flux going through different parts of the system and also at any given time in its evolution. So I'd like to finish by summarizing what we've explored and discussed through this talk. We've talked about the architecture of sediment bypass in deep water systems, the facies that you want to look out for, the expression of bypass into thicker stratigraphic sequences, and how different morphologies and features can be used to interpret down dip bypass, whether this be channels, scours, or even stepped profiles in your slope on the seafloor. We've also honed in on the key controls on bypass that dictate those different facies: grain size, sediment concentration, slope, and flow size. And then all of this sort of information we've then plugged into a simple physical model and explored whether we could put numbers on deposition versus bypass through a simple 2D deep water system. And the answer is we can, but it's very complicated. And I think this is a frontier of where we should start to go next in being more quantitative and building that bridge between qualitative field interpretations and quantitative coding, modeling, and experiments. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Chris. This was wonderful. I learned a lot and I didn't know much too. So no, this is very, very good.
Well, that's great. Yeah.
Any questions from the audience?
And the more simple, the better. It doesn't matter.
Perhaps while people are gathering their thoughts, I had a question about the antecedent slope and the slope post gravity flow. And I was wondering, it seems bimodal in the sense that if you have a steep slope, you might get more bypass than when you have a milder slope. And could that also like build up to even generate these different slopes that you find on the seafloor? Pardon my ignorance again.
No, so the interesting thing is that there's an interplay between the flow's ability to transport a particular grain size and the slope, which dictates how fast it can go, right? So if your slope is steep, the flow might go fast, but it might be carrying very coarse material, and therefore it actually might not bypass that much because it's actually depositing all of that coarse material. However, you're right. If you have a slope that drives the flow to go fast and it's only carrying finer grain material, let's say, then you'll get a positive feedback where the slope is bypassed or indeed gets eroded, which steepens the slope, and you only get deposition on the flatter parts of the system. And so it will propagate steps and changes in your slope profile that promote acute zones of bypass or deposition. So yeah, not a stupid question at all.
Thank you. No, I think this is clear. Thank you so much. Anyone else? You can raise your hand or unmute or post a question in the chat.
Yeah, can anyone get in the chat here?
I see one question in the chat. Do you see the chat as well, Chris? Otherwise, yes. I can read it out.
All right. So, is it possible that some grain size breaks are due to sediment provenance rather than flow bypass? Yeah. So you mean, for example, if we have a bimodal distribution in our sediment source, where we have raw sands and mud, that's all we have. That will generate a grain size break. What we find, because I tested this actually, and what we find is that when we map individual event beds from proximal areas where we see grain size breaks, and then we map those deposits, individual beds, for hundreds of kilometers down dip, those grain sizes that are missing appear down dip, and they appear without the grain size breaks. So those are special cases where we can actually correlate those individual event beds. But at a system scale, we can also examine the kind of bulk grain size composition of proximal localities versus more distal localities. And again, what we find is, missing grain sizes in proximal areas such as, medium or to fine sands are found in thick-bedded turbinates down dip. So it's possible that provenance can generate grain size breaks, but I think that would be a rare exception. And in every example I've looked at so far, that has not been the case. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Chris. I hope, Pandit, that was clear. I think it was. If anyone else had it, I had one more question, but I would like to, if there is anyone else, please go ahead. Otherwise, I see someone has unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Chris. Kai here. Great talk. Really, really interesting. I was wondering, has anybody been able to model these grain size breaks, like with a physical model, or is it just the scale too large that you wouldn't be able to do it?
Yeah. Yeah, you could tell that's a difficult question because I don't know to think about that. Yes and no. So I think numerically, grain size breaks have not been properly modelled, not convincingly. There are sophisticated models that produce, flow behaviours and resulting depositional architectures, but typically these simplify those behaviors into, can the flow velocity carry that particular grain size? If it can, it goes. That's it. And so you typically get coarse proximally and then progressively fining distally. Experiments have actually produced something equivalent to a grain size break in a circular flume. Mr. Sumner, back in 2008, spun up an annular flume with lots of sand and then progressively decelerated it. And what she found was that your aggradation rates were initially very high, and as they progressively decreased with decreasing flow velocity, at some point at around the fine sand mark, there was a hiatus in deposition for like a few minutes. Flow velocity was constantly or linearly decreasing, but the aggradation rate paused. And you got this bypass surface essentially being generated in the annular flume before deposition recommenced. So if that was a gravity flow, that would produce a grain size break. So experiments have produced behavior that would model these grain size breaks, but at your gravity currents, you can't scale them properly at the moment. So, yeah. So, yes and no. Summary. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just another ignorant question from me, Chris. I'm curious, I couldn't help but make the relation to just regular continental rivers and how much of the sediment that gets fed to them is also bypassed. I was wondering if you try to make this link, what's similar and what's different.
Yeah. So, absolutely, I've thought about this quite a lot because actually that's comment I made right at the start, where we need to, as field geologists or sedimentologists, whether we're working in the modern or ancient, we tend to look at deposits. And so we have a deposit bias. But actually, most sedimentary systems are agents of transport, not deposition. And so a lot of the fascies that we see in deep water systems also applies to rivers. That said, I think the sorts of fascies that indicate sediment bypass in rivers tend to be bed forms, tractional reworking of the riverbed, because actually a river does not need sediment to flow. It just needs water. And that's the critical difference between rivers and gravity currents. So a river might be mostly bypassing, but because it doesn't need sediment to flow, the amount of sediment being bypassed might be extremely small. Versus if you were to see dune scale crossbeds or ripple crossbeds in a turbinite deposit, that means a lot of bypass and tractional reworking of the bed, but sediment is driving that flow downslope. So it's associated with more sediment bypass. So that's the big difference.
Thank you. I see there's another question here in the chat.
Let me expand it to Biggie. There we go. Max. Hi, Max. Okay. It looks like your sedimentation in the numerical model is backfilling according to timelines. Are you seeing the role of reshuffling of sediment along the profile, perhaps on intermediate timelines. Does sediment spend time higher upstream before it gets resuspended and transported further downstream? Yes, okay. What drives the flows when the composite bypass surface starts becoming a site of deposition? Right. Okay, so yeah. So 3-part question really. The nature of the deposition, and then the nature of the evolution of that stratigraphy, and how it gets eroded, resculpted, and transported down dip. Yes, what happens to the deposits is that the flows build depositional relief, and then the subsequent flows will interact with that depositional relief and produce backfilling or backstepping deposits. Some of the flow will overspill, but it does promote this backstepping turbidite fill. Now, with subsequent flows, they are able to erode and resculpt existing turbidite deposition and the seafloor. So what happens is those depositional timelines, as it were, can get eroded by subsequent flows, and those timelines get compressed into a composite bypass surface. And that's why you get, so depending on where and how deep that erosion is in the along slope profile, that's why you get sporadic compression of timelines into composite bypass surfaces, and then those surfaces variably and sporadically correlate to depositional packages of varying thicknesses at varying positions down the system profile. So essentially, in answer to your question, what drives those composite bypass surfaces? It is the migration of erosional scours in different points along the system. So whether they're located at the base of slope, or further up the slope, or further down into the kind of basin floor parts of the system. Does that make sense, Max?
I think it did. Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
No problem. Yeah.
Perfect. Good. I see it's already past 4. So thanks, Chris, again for your wonderful talk.
It's a pleasure.
It will be on it's already on YouTube, but it will be recorded on YouTube, I think, today or tomorrow. So for everyone else who didn't catch everything. So thanks again, and hope to see everyone next week for another Source Sync talk. Thank you.
Thank you.